In this episode, Holly and I answer the question, should I ever stop funding the PUA Rider on my infinite banking policy? She's Holly, and she helps people find financial freedom.
He's Nate. He makes sense out of money. This is Dollars and Nonsense. If you follow the herd, you will be slaughtered.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. So great to have you, and great to have Holly here. It's been a little while, Holly, since you and I both sat down to shoot an episode.
It has.
So good to see you and hear from you. Of course, we talk all the time, but just on the podcast. And, you know, today we wanted to dive in and talk about a very common question that we get from people who are doing infinite banking. And honestly, just in the community at large, like the infinite banking community, there's kind of a couple different camps developing of like, hey, you should fund your paid up addition rider for forever. No, you should stop funding it at some point. And I feel like as most of the time from my personality, who lives kind of in a gray area a lot of the times, and thinks very nuanced about almost everything, which is good at times and bad at times. I kind of wish I could just be very decisive sometimes, and instead I'm like waffling around like, I can see good in both scenarios. That's definitely the case with this. I can see good in both scenarios between, you know, funding your paid up addition rider for as long as possible, or the alternative route of like, hey, funding a policy and getting a lot of paid up addition riders in the early years, but then as the policy gets more mature, after year 5 or so, you can reduce PUAs and use that cash flow to help launch new policies. That's kind of the two camps, really, in the grand scheme of things. And I guess the first statement I'll make on this front is that it's never a bad thing to put money into your paid up addition rider. It's always a good thing. So we'll start from that point of view, no matter what else we say. Never a bad thing to put money into a paid up addition rider. Doesn't matter how old the policy is. It's always great.
It is, and I think the other thing is that every policy and every situation is uniquely different, so that you have to stop it at this point, or you should never put it in after this point, or you should always put it in. I'm going to say it depends based on where you're at financially and what you want to do in your goals. So The reality is there's not just a simple answer. You stop and do it here, or you stop and do it there. The reality is exactly what Nate said. It's always a good place to put money, irregardless of where you're at in the process.
Yeah, if you have money, the paid up addition rider is always great. So that then maybe people would have a question, Holly, like, you know, a lot of times historically when we've built policies and we're like going over them with clients, a lot of the time we will show maybe like a 5-year window of funding paid up addition rider premiums. And then on the example that we're showing, we'll have them drop off the paid up addition rider and just pay the base premium or something like that. The whole purpose of this episode is to be like, okay, well, why do we do that? And what does that even mean for clients? And what do they typically see when we do that? Whether or not we want them to see like their perspective, essentially. So I guess what I'm going to go from that point is saying, hey, the paid up additions rider of your policy is where the vast majority of cash value is going to come from in the early years. And the reason for that is because, hey, we want to start practicing this banking idea. We want to build very cash-rich policies. And if the base premium doesn't really build much cash value in the first couple of years, you want to minimize that and maximize the paid up additions rider so you can stuff it with cash value and start using the policies right away and building capital and taking advantage of opportunities and all the fun stuff of infinite banking. And so essentially what this means is that the policy desperately needs big paid up addition rider premiums in the early years as it's getting going. We've historically used the metaphor that the PUA Rider acts like a rocket booster. It's like launching the policy, it's getting it into orbit. But once it's launched and profitable by year 4 or 5, at that point, the paid up additions rider is no longer necessary for the policy to perform well. Whether you fund any dollar into the paid up addition rider or not after that point, the policy doesn't care. If you fund it, great. It's going to put more money in. It's going to be growing. But if you don't fund it, the policy is going to be very profitable, very efficient. It's going to make you a lot of money with just paying the base premium from then on out. Because the base premium by year 5 is just as effective. In fact, the argument can be made it's more effective than the paid up additions rider at that stage of life inside the policy. And so here we are. We're left with this idea where like, hey, the paid up addition rider is desperately needed for the first 5 years. It's always been optional. It's optional in year 5. It's never required to be paid. You really do want it early on. After year 5, though, that's really year 4, year 5. That's where we're having the question. Do I want to continue funding the paid up additions rider, or do I want to reduce the PUA to allow me to open a new policy? And I think, Holly, you said it very well. The answer to that question is going to be more based on where the individual is at the time that their policy is well capitalized
Yes.
and what their goals are and where they want to go. Because it can make sense to stop funding the paid-up addition rider, and it can make sense to keep funding the paid-up addition rider as your plan, depending on where you're at. So I think that's really where we're going to delve at this point.
There's not a simple solution or answer. You can max it out. You can do something in between. You can put the minimum in. That's why it really is important that you're working with your agent to determine where you want to go and what you want to do and how much cash you have and where you want to store that cash. If we don't have the PUA on there in the beginning, you don't have cash. So that's why it is essential that it is on there and it's part of it. But it's a place, whether you're putting the maximum amount in or the minimum amount in, it's a place to actually store cash and have it grow. And so that's
which is great year 1, is great year 5, is great year 10. Like the paid-up addition rider is always good. I believe the most common situation for almost everyone to be in is they're technically putting in less premium than they should be putting in. Most people's window of premium paying ability is smaller than they technically should be. That's not always the case. Some people are right on target. Some people maybe have a bigger window than they actually need because they've been doing this for a long time and they've been doing it the way we teach. Most people, though, have a smaller window. So let's say you have somebody who wants to start a $20,000 policy, as an example, just like a simple $20,000 premium. That's where they want to put in is $20,000. And so that maybe the base premium is going to be $6,000 and the MEC limit is going to be $20,000. And so you got the base premium here and you're max funding your PUA rider with like $14,000. So you've got a total of $20,000 going into the policy, some of it base, some of it paid-up additions or whatever it is. Technically speaking, though, that person actually likely has 25, 30, 35, 40 grand. It can fluctuate of actual money that comes in their way throughout the year that they could be putting into a policy, but they chose the 20 grand because it was comfortable. They knew they could hit it. It wasn't stressful to them. And that's awesome. Like, keep doing that. Everybody should start doing that. But then they're putting in 20 grand a year, but technically they could be putting in 25, 30, 35, but they're not really sure they want to like schedule $30,000 a year of premiums. They're not sure if they're ready for that type of commitment. So they say, okay, I'm not going to schedule it out. Well, now we go 5 years down the road and they put in 20 grand every single year, but they technically could have put a little bit more in. What typically I suggest is that whenever we get to year 5, your existing policy is not going to need paid-up additions anymore. You could put it in. It's going to be great to put it in. It's just not necessary to put it in anymore. The policy is going to be awesome without it. And so now we're left with this question. Well, what we could do is we could reduce the paid-up addition rider on this policy as part of our schedule to where we're now only scheduling you to pay the base premium. Now, you're welcome to put in all 20. I hope you do. But at the end of the day, we're going to reduce it maybe down to $6,000 base premium. And you could go take that $14,000 of paid-up addition rider premium and launch a brand new policy with it, funding both the base and the paid-up addition rider on that policy, and get that one launched and get it profitable without actually having to change your scheduled amount. Like in your head, you're still just putting in the same amount as you always were, $20,000 a year. But what you've changed is that you actually now have the ability with $14,000 in the new policy of premium that you're scheduling, and technically you still have the room for 20 grand, even though we're not scheduling 20 grand, you still have the room to still put 20 grand. Now you actually have $34,000 of room to put money in. So how it plays out in reality is, okay, we're scheduling $20,000 to go in across 2 policies, but I have the room to put in $34,000 across 2 policies, and I can just make random dump-in contributions to the paid-up addition rider of policy number 1. So now if I have an extra 5 grand here, an extra 3 grand there, an extra 2 grand here, there is space to put it. But psychologically, I still feel nice and safe and calm and everything's fun. So that's why I've always said is, numbers on paper mean a lot, but nobody makes decisions deep down based on numbers on pieces of paper, whether it's more efficient to keep PUAs on or not, or all these things. All of that is hogwash because psychologically, you have to be willing to do what makes the most sense. What makes the most sense would have just been to start with a $30,000 policy. Like, that's what would have made the most sense. Then we wouldn't even have to be talking about this, per se. But that's just not where most people are at. And so they don't have the ability to dump in 5 grand here, 5 grand there, to their policies because there's no room, because they're maxing out the ones they have and they don't want to commit to a higher schedule. Whether or not that's fair or not, that's just where they're at. And so we're trying to help people grow in the system and be better practitioners of infinite banking without harming their psychological framework and like making them feel stressed about things.
Well, and I think too, the benefit of that, Nate, is it brings more peace of mind even. I know people say you don't make decisions with your heart, you make it with your head. But logically, people can see, yes, I can afford this, but rationally, they don't want to commit to something that high. And so that's why they actually start out normally lower, and then they work to a higher amount that they know they can afford. But then at that point, they probably could afford even more. The other thing too that's essential in why we leave it on for that 5 years and we show it dropping off really is because that is, and I'm just going to stress this, that's the longest you should wait if you only have one policy before you start another one. Because your policy really can only hold so much cash. And then when you have this extra cash isn't when you want to be applying to start another policy. You want to already have it to be able to put that money in there versus like, oh, now let me start a policy. And then maybe it takes a little bit of time or it doesn't. But then you're like, well, I found something else to spend that money on instead of putting it in the policy first.
Yeah. I mean, the more room, the bigger the window you have to be able to pay premiums, a lot of times the better off you are. But there's some caveats to that because you don't want to open a policy that has this big window, like a big MEC limit of like $50,000, $100,000, if you're not a person who can get anywhere close to that at your current level. So my common recommendation is start where the window of being able to pay premiums is sufficient for you. If you need a $500,000 window to pay premiums, because that's possibly how much capital you can move in every single year, that's awesome, great, do it. But don't do it with hopes that you might get there one day. Go ahead and start with what makes sense right now for wherever you're at financially, and then add new policies down the road. Sometimes people need a little bit of a kick in the pants, a little bit of psychological help to actually practice. That's why I did the 4 stages of IBC commitment, webinar and podcast, and we've talked about it a few times, mainly just simply because most people, they spend a ton of time listening to podcasts like this. They're like, I really believe in this, but they can't bring themselves to do it. They can't bring themselves because of fear. Oftentimes, a fear of premium. I mentioned this many times. It's a fear of premium. It's some psychological issues like, or maybe misunderstandings or ignorance. That's why when we give advice, it's kind of like Dave Ramsey. I've said this many times before. He's actually willing to admit that some of his advice is logically incorrect. And I brought this up on the show before a few different times, Holly, where he'll be talking to somebody who, like let's say Ben Shapiro, they did an interview, and I brought this up a couple times really, just because I thought it was insightful. Whenever Ben Shapiro said to him, you teach this whole idea of the snowball, debt pay down, where you start with the smallest debt first, and then you pay that off, and you roll the money into larger and larger debts until you're completely debt free. And it's a good strategy. But Ben's like, technically speaking though, if you wanted to pay your debt off the fastest, you would choose not the smallest amount, you would choose the debt with the highest interest rate and pay that first. Because if you run the numbers, technically speaking, you'll pay your debt off faster by paying down the higher interest debt first, not the smallest debt first. And that's just right. That's just how math works. And so he's like, so why do we encourage people to do the snowball effect? And Dave's answer was 100% true, and we are all dealing with this in the financial world. He says, if you got yourself into a whole bunch of high interest debt, the problem is not math. The problem is like a psychological problem. It's something deeper. It's not like you got into credit card debt because of math. So math's not going to get you out. That was his idea. You need to have some victories, and you need to help yourself get into an environment where you can grow, because your environment matters a lot. In other words, arguing whether or not you should pay, the policy is better if you just pay PUAs for forever, or if you pay PUAs for a short period of time and then take that cash flow and open a new policy, and you could just run numbers on a page out and end up like 30 years down the road with a certain amount of cash value, and you can say, well, I'm just going to do the one that makes the most money at that point in time. We're saying that's not the whole picture though, because it's assuming that the premium amount of that one policy and of every future policy is exactly going to be perfect to match up 100% with every dollar of free cash flow that you will ever have. And that is nonsense. So the reality is you will start more policies in the future. Sometimes we need a little bit of help. We need to reduce the schedule of the paid up additions rider to free up cash flow to open new policies, or else we won't. And that is the truth, whether people like it or not. And so this is why we've kind of been in that middle ground where we're not here saying you have to, or you like it's not a good idea to fund PUAs after a period of time. But what we're saying is maybe it would be helpful to you to stop funding your PUAs as part of your schedule. Use that money to open up a new policy to expand your window of premium paying ability, so you can fund the extra $3,000 here, the extra $5,000 there, the extra $10,000 there, and so forth. So it's, once again, we're just trying to help people become the best infinite banker that they can be. And sometimes you guys clients need a little bit of swift kick in the pants. They need a little bit of encouragement, psychological help, not just numbers on paper, which has never, created a desire to do anything in reality.
Nobody plans on getting in debt. They don't plan on it rationally, unless they really are. And I'm just going to say this. Some of us don't plan it, but we honestly do not live within our means. So that is why we're in the debt versus others that maybe planned accordingly and this and that, and life happened, right? Different things happen. And that is the beauty, in my opinion, of why you might start out smaller when you initially plan your life insurance policy, and why we encourage you to have additional ones, so that you do have those windfall moments or those places where you can pull from more than one or put money in more than one and be able to access that money and utilize it for your life. And I think that it's not a debate of when should you stop putting in PUA or you should. The debate really is, when do you want to start another policy, and how many policies do you need to be able to put cash into?
Exactly. In a hypothetical world, it would be nice if all of your free cash flow could go into policies. It's hard to define that 100% exactly what it's going to be, especially when you're projecting into the future. So that's why it's very rare for somebody to have just one policy to begin with. And this is also why, we recommend at some point taking a look at, hey, should we stop funding PUAs if it will allow you to feel good about expanding the system, likely to the point where it should be anyway. So I think a big piece of it is psychological. There's a couple other points I wanted to make on it too, though, Holly, that are maybe less psychological but just practical. Even if you were to build a policy, at some point in time, you actually are going to be required to stop funding PUAs at the max level, depending on how the policy is built. The MEC limit is the top of the window for policy premiums. You can't put more in than the MEC limit at any given time, and the MEC limit's kind of created at the very beginning of the policy life. That being said, it's not static. So for whatever reason, and I don't know the calculation, I'm not fully aware of how they get to this actuarially, but as the policy gets older, at some point, especially depending on how the policy is built, the MEC limit will change as time goes on for some reason, and what you used to be able to put in $20,000, but suddenly you can't. And it can depend on how you build the policy. There's some people who build these 1090 style policy with a little tiny base and big, huge PUA premiums. And those are typically policies that really work pretty well if your main goal is to fund over a short period of time, maybe. But those policies will run out of PUA room fast. You'll be at year 10 and it's tapped out, you're not going to be able to put more money into the PUA. So then you have to go start a new policy because the MEC limit is changing on your current policy because the base premium is so small. And so policies with larger base premiums can support paid up additional rate premiums for a longer runway.
Are you tired of feeling like everyone has their hand in your pocket? At Living Wealth, we believe in challenging the status quo. After all, most of those conventional tools only seem to make someone else rich. Let us show you how to take back control by banking on yourself. Visit livingwealth.com/escapethebank. You'll receive instant access to what we call the beginner's course. This free, in-depth, easy-to-follow course teaches people how to create and profit from infinite banking. We not only discuss the philosophy and principles behind infinite banking, but also offer real-life examples to demonstrate how it works. Even folks experienced with infinite banking often tell us they learned a ton too. So, it's worthwhile regardless of your experience level. Stop letting banks and Wall Street dictate your financial future. Again, that's livingwealth.com/escapethebank to gain access to the free course today. Now back to Nate and Holly.
One other thing to note as I'm kind of wrapping this up is that the paid up edition rider, a lot of times why we will illustrate it for people only showing 5 years of paid up editions to launch the policy is because we want to help people understand that the paid up edition rider is a flexible thing, that after a certain amount of time, it is no longer required to fund the paid up edition rider window. In fact, it's never required. We want people to know that it's never required to fund the paid up editions. But after year 5, especially, the policy doesn't even need it. So all that to say, the paid up edition rider, the reason why we show it this way is because, hey, this is what we want to do. We want to pay 5 years of premiums. That's our goal. We want you to be able to do that. If you can keep going after that, that's awesome. If you can't, that's awesome. Should we open a new policy? Maybe, probably, I don't know. Typically, by the way, the last thing I'll say on that front is that the longer runway someone has, that they have to be able to build policies. So, like, in other words, if you're like 25 and you start a policy, I think it's more likely the younger you are and the bigger the runway is, that you will stop funding a scheduled PUA rider after you've gotten your policy capitalized and profitable to free up space to go open new policies. But an older individual, like someone who's in their 60s, they probably won't. In fact, depending on the scenario, but the runway's not that high, so we probably will just say, no, just keep the policy you have and keep max funding it for as long as possible. We're probably not going to go start a brand new policy at this point.
Well, I mean, I was even talking to some older clients that they only have one policy due to their age, really, on themselves. And they're like, do we keep funding this? And for them, it made sense to keep funding it because this is one of the only places or resources they have to store cash. Yeah. And so it didn't make sense at their age to actually start another policy and change that funding level. And it's where they were comfortable with that. That's where it goes back to that answer. The runway is a great analogy. How long you have to fund it, as well as how much premium you're currently putting in as well, can depend on whether you do start another one in 5 years or not. It's not a golden rule that you have to start another one every 5 years. But the reality is you do want somewhere, and more than one place if possible, to store and put your money to be able to utilize it now and in the future.
What I like for people to see is that, hey, when we start a brand new policy, we want you to kind of commit to at least attempting to max fund it for 5 years. And I think a lot of us can agree to this. Like, okay, we can launch this policy and max fund it. At least we think we can. That's our goal. You don't ever have to fund a PUA. But after year 5, you could still fund a PUA and it'd be great. But at the end of the day, we want every policy that's built to have 4 to 5 years of good, solid, high, paid up edition rider premiums of getting a good amount in. And then after that, it doesn't really matter. That's why you could say, okay, I'll schedule. If everything is still remaining the same and your ability to pay premiums is still the same at year 5, you may decide to go start a new policy and reduce the scheduled PUA premiums on the existing one and just use it as a place to dump in random amounts of paid up edition rider premium as time goes on while you're keeping the schedule around the same. There's kind of two camps to wrap it up. There's the camp of, hey, pay PUAs for forever, pay PUAs for a short period of time, and there's everywhere in between. I'm saying there's some benefits of both. I do think you should pay PUAs for as long as you possibly can. I do think, though, that reducing the schedule can help psychologically get people into a position where they have a bigger window of space to fund policies and have room to dump in random amounts of money whenever they want to, and that can be very beneficial for a lot of people. So that's why we typically show it that way. That's why we kind of encourage about year 5 to take a look at what your life looks like and what you may want to be doing. Just a great system to be in. It kind of helps people operate IBC in a better way is what we found.
Well, and I just want to say, Nate, that's one reason we ask that the 4 stages of commitment of IBC is very essential to understand where you want to go and how to actually design your policy. So I'm just going to plug that in. Yeah. Go and find that.
Can't be plugged enough.
Yeah, because that is essential to know where you want to go and how we can help you build that system for you. But the second thing is we always ask, and the reason we ask is, what can you commit to 4 or 5 years? The reality is your life can change in 5 years as well, but we want that premium amount to be something that you can max fund it for those 5 years and design it that way so you have the ability to put in the maximum cash and have an amazing system or first policy to start your system with. And so that's why we show it dropping off, really, isn't to just stop funding the policy, is to show you what it looks like for those first 5 years.
Exactly right. And yeah, just a shameless plug for the 4 stages of IBC commitment. It's the most logical framework for how to set up your IBC system, from where you're at and where you want to start and what you're comfortable with. So that you can find that on our YouTube channel, the 4 stages of IBC commitment. Once again, for all the listeners, if you are enjoying this content, if it's meaningful to you, man, it would mean the world to us if you would like or subscribe to our YouTube channel, like the video, make a comment, let us know how you're doing, let us know if the content's helping you, let us know if you have any questions by commenting on the YouTube video. We'll peruse those and we'll use those as topic ideas for the future. So go ahead and leave a comment there. We'll take a look at them. We'll answer your questions on there. Maybe we'll even do a whole episode just to answer your question if it's an awesome question. So all that to say, it's been a pleasure as always. This has been Dollars and Nonsense. If you follow the herd, you will be slaughtered.
Listener, one last thing before you go. Start your journey towards financial security and wealth today. Visit livingwealth.com/escape the bank. Upon completing this course, you'll have all the information that you'll need to see if infinite banking is right for you. Again, go to livingwealth.com/escape the bank.